Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce the ideas of transformative innovation policy as they have been developed up to now, and in a very introductory way. In the next period, I'm going to introduce a series of concepts, try to show how those concepts fit together into a new way of thinking about innovation policy, and how projects and programs can be defined in terms of this new perspective. Okay? In order to do that, we have to build some sort of foundations, and some of those foundations are departures from common understanding or prior understanding drawn from innovation policy, or just ordinary how do we think about the world? Because some of the ideas in transformative innovation policy, in fact, differ from conventional ways of looking at the world. We start with the world as it is. And so the first section of the 5 that I'll be talking about is the world we are in. And then I will proceed to talk about the other 4 topics after that. Okay, in terms of the world we are in, it's apparent that we are confronted by a series of existential threats. Existential threats means threats to the future of civilization, or perhaps the world as we know it. One of these is greenhouse gas emissions, GHG, and how greenhouse gases contribute to climate change. Climate change, in turn, has an impact on biodiversity. Biodiversity is a necessity for human life as well as other life on the planet. And ultimately, as the diagram at the bottom, or the picture at the bottom shows, there is a question of the sea level, which is particularly relevant to those of us who live on islands. Because as sea level rises, we will be living in an archipelago rather than an island. And it's not only environmental issues that are constituting an existential threat. We also have a worsening income distribution within countries. It's very important not to overstate this rich running ahead of the poor, because in my lifetime, there has been a very substantial improvement in the material conditions of the world's poor. Okay? So it is quite realistic now, for example, to imagine meeting the Sustainable Development Goal, which I'll talk about in just a moment, of eradicating extreme poverty. Right? We're actually on track to doing that. We're not so on track to eliminating poverty as nationally defined, which is one of the other facets of the income distribution goal. But the disparity between income and wealth is creating serious problems. And finally, increases in waste and the depletion of resources. I'm more skeptical than some of my colleagues about the magnitude of peak, whatever it is, manganese, oil, whatever, because innovation does tend to extend the resource base along with exhaustion. But at the end of the day, the world is finite, and the rates of exploitation of resources are exponential. So there is a crunch at some point between availability and use. Well, that's sort of the bad news. The good news is that there is international recognition of a number of these issues in the form of the Sustainable Development Goals. and that these have been broadly adopted as a desired policy by both the global North and the global South. So many governments are trying to position their policies, their actions, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you open these boxes, then you'll find that there are a lot of detailed sub-goals within these goals. And the degree of, shall we say, seriousness with which people are addressing the sub-goals differs across countries. But at least there's a large global consensus that these are worthwhile goals for humanity as a whole to address. But there isn't a blueprint for attaining these goals. Okay? We have actions that we think might be relevant. They might take us in the direction of meeting the goals, but by no means is there a blueprint. And that is particularly a problem when we think about what is the nature of change that's required. And here's the first of the concepts that I want to get across that varies from our ordinary understanding of how technology and society interact. And it's the idea of a socio-technical system. And a socio-technical system is not a sector of the economy, nor is it a techno-economic system which is about a market. It's a much more expansive idea that includes not only the actors who are suppliers, but also those people that consume goods and services within a particular area. And in fact, in that regard, it's better to start from the idea that socio-technical systems are defined by human purposes and needs. The idea of socio-technical systems is meant to include not only various things that are material, both production and consumption, but also cultural meanings and symbolic meanings in these systems, socio-technical systems. So, for example, I grew up in a state famous for making automobiles, and the state where Detroit was located. So in my life, I've participated in automobile culture. And automobile culture had a lot of symbolic meanings, okay? Automobiles as status symbols, automobiles as independence, automobiles as teenage sexual adventure opportunities, okay? These were all symbolic or cultural meanings of the automobile. So a socio-technical system is inclusive of a variety of ways to think about how technologies and people interact. Simone.
Thank you very much. Given your definition of socio-technical systems, how many socio-technical systems are there?
That's a question which has two answers. One is there are as many as you would like for the purpose of analysis. Okay? On the other hand, you want to have a socio-technical system be sufficiently broad that you're talking about the common need or common purposes of a large number of people. Otherwise, the system aspect breaks down. Okay? So at one point, one could talk about the socio-technical system of comic books. And in that case, it was a very narrow specific audience, age delimited, and so forth and so on. Today, that's not the case. It's a much broader system. I'd still have some problems with that as a socio-technical system, because separating it from other parts of publishing and other leisure activities or leisure activities that people might engage in is a bit of a challenge. But it depends on your purposes of analysis. So you can view society as a collection of these socio-technical systems. And doing so emphasizes the interdependencies between human purposes, technologies, customs, and habits of thought in both supply and use. So an example that we use of such a system is mobility. Okay? So the automobile plays a role in the socio-technical system of mobility, but so does the bicycle and transport and walking. Okay? All the means to go from point A to B, to move about, are within the mobility socio-technical system. And when we begin to think of the problem not as an artifact, not as how a machine will take you from point A to point B, but to think about human needs to move from A to B, then we can think of a larger variety of solutions for how mobility can be achieved. And this expansion in the opportunities for addressing human needs is a key feature that a socio-technical system viewpoint brings to the table. The bottom line here is that meeting the Sustainable Development Goals is something that will require a very fundamental change in the socio-technical systems that we are currently employing, how they are currently constituted. And that's because we need to make what we are calling a deep transition. And the deep transition in industrial times has happened once. And it largely happened in this country with the increasing consumption of coal as a fuel. What did coal allow? Coal allowed us to escape from the current output of the sun. Insolation is a technical term for it, which is what the sun does in terms of bringing wind and rain, to bring windmills to make grind grain, water to similarly grind grain and use water power, that grain to feed animals, the animals to do mechanical work, but it also to feed us to do mechanical work. These are the energy sources prior to the intensive use of fossil fuels. We have a little bit on the side with the burning of wood, but if you think about it for a moment, wood is a relatively recent product of the sun. The sun wasn't shining, we wouldn't have wood to burn in our fireplaces. What fossil fuels do is allow us to consume the accumulation of millions of years of human, not human, but pre-human civilization, not civilization, life on Earth, okay? So that pre-human development that laid down the deposits of coal, and as we later exploit, petroleum, provide a boost, a gain. Largely, that can be associated with very substantial improvement in human welfare over the past 250 years. It's very questionable whether we would have a degree of advancement that we do without having tapped into fossil fuels. However, it hasn't worked out so well because the burning of fossil fuels contributes to the greenhouse gas burden and ultimately is responsible for the climate change existential threat that I discussed a moment ago. So when I say that the world needs to have fundamental change in socio-technical systems, what I'm talking about is making another deep transition, a severing of our reliance on fossil fuels in order to achieve a more sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. What we might then think about is what role innovation policy can play in helping to make a more sustainable future. Do we have the knowledge needed to make a second deep transition? If we admit that we do not, and I do not believe that we do, then how can technology and innovation policy, as well as other policies, be mobilized to tackle the needs? Johann Schott and myself wrote a paper, 3 Frames for Innovation Policy, which reviews the different framings or objectives of policy from the past to the present. And what we argue is that there is an emerging third frame. I'll get to that in just a moment. But if we think of the first frame, many of you will encounter this as the linear model. Okay. The linear model is a kind of pipeline in which if we invest more money in science, we get more useful knowledge, which is then applicable to human betterment and human needs. So from that perspective, if you think that that is really the accurate description, the predominant description that we need to understand the world, then addressing sustainability goals is a matter of putting more money into the pipe so that we get more useful outputs at the end. That will give us more choice, more alternatives, more solutions, more possibilities for the future. However, this frame has had some disappointments. One of them is that there's only a modest correlation between the amount that any given country invests in science and its ability to make progress towards a higher level of social and economic development. Related to this is that less advanced economies have been frustrated by the promise that's made by Frame 1 thinking that once that knowledge is produced, it's available everywhere. And if it's available everywhere, then what explains why some countries are very far behind other countries in terms of the utilization of the knowledge? It must be some kind of failure of technology transfer or worse. Okay? It may have implications about corruption or mismanagement or other very pejorative kinds of ideas about why the country is unable to take advantage of this common pool of knowledge. Third, the results from Frame 1 have created major social problems as well as advances, as well as improvements. So science creates monsters as well as benefits. Perhaps most importantly, Frame 1 is a very indirect way of addressing the social needs and existential threats that I spoke about earlier. And as it is constituted, it is a way for existing elites, existing actors who wish to have business as usual to capture the policies, to capture the direction of investment, and not to make the kind of fundamental changes that are required. So Frame 1 thinking has problems. However, Frame 1 nevertheless is useful because we need to have a greater stock of knowledge, even if not everyone can equally exploit it and develop it. It still is a long-term benefit for humankind. Well, Frame 2 kind of thinking, often referred to as national systems of innovation, or from that the broader idea of systems of innovation, said that it's not only a problem of market failure, the absence of incentives of private actors to invest in the creation of science, and therefore the necessity of government, but also the problem that there may be underdeveloped or dysfunctional links horizontally and vertically between all of the actors that are necessary to bring innovations into life. These breakdowns can be thought of as system failures. Now, a key motivation for Frame 2 was the desire to perform in an increasingly globalized world in a more effective and competitive way. And there has been some success in applying Frame 2 thinking to improving competitiveness. Like Frame 1, however, Frame 2 indicates that the regulation of scientific and technical advance should be only undertaken when problems become apparent. So the style is ex post regulation of possible problems, or better, problems that can be demonstrated. We can think about, for example, how long it took before cigarettes were actually seriously constrained by regulation, and how in many countries of the world the state tobacco monopolies are still actively promoting people's smoking, even though this will cause serious health problems in the future. Of course, it will reduce the Social Security payments as well in some of those countries. Frame 2's focus on competitiveness and development conceived as economic growth diverts attention from social needs. This is a strong statement, certainly a contestable one, because some people that believe in the Frame 2 approach say, no, we have not ignored social needs. That's a matter for political decision-making in the allocation of resources within the system. Okay? But in that sense, there is a good deal of similarity between frame 1 and frame 2. The social needs and purposes are externalized to the management, from the management of science and technology, and made part of another system, a political system. So what is frame 3? Like frame 2, frame 3 is a response to the historically prior way of thinking. Frame 3 thinking focuses directly on social needs and challenges. It's based on the belief that frame 1 and 2 are not themselves adequate to achieve the needed deep transition or to adequately address other social goals such as the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, there's much debate to be had about the word adequate in this context, okay? Because adequacy has much to do with political will, desire, and consensus within the society to address particular needs. And perhaps we'll come to that in a few moments. But frame 3 thinking seeks to identify and utilize methods for more inclusive decision-making to bring all parts of society along with the transition. Why is this significant? Because both frames 1 and frames 2 are essentially managed by and key decisions are taken by a technocratic elite. Julian.
So, hi, thanks Ed. Are you saying that mission-orientated policies are compatible with frame 3 thinking?
Well, they could be. It's really a question of what in practice mission-oriented policies amount to. Okay? So in the first instance, if we think about mission-oriented policies of the past, for example, the United States determination to put a man on the moon, okay, then it's definitely true that a technocratic elite took all the relevant decisions. Okay? There weren't other people consulted, and it was only because it was seen as a matter of national prestige that other people in the society were able to go along with the idea, helped by the fact that the person who announced the goal was shot and killed not very long after he announced the promise. So it became a kind of memorial as well. But it's those kinds of things that really shape mission-oriented policies of the past. Now, mission-oriented policies have become a key buzzword within policy circles of late. And what it remains to be seen is whether the processes that are established have the same capture of the process by the technocratic elites, or whether in some way they are more democratic and inclusive than the policies of the past. Okay. So the answer could be, okay, remains to be seen, has some significant risks associated with it because of past experience and models for managing and running mission-oriented research. Frame 3 thinking also seeks means to anticipate problems ex ante, or in the process of research and development. Frame 3 thinking has a critical edge, much as I expressed in the answer to your question, being very suspicious of incumbents and co-optation. the possibility of being redirected towards existing interests and existing powers. Frame 3 prioritizes human flourishing, which is a very somewhat grandiose term, which means basically that people see themselves as having a better life. And we know that people seeing themselves as having a better life is only loosely correlated with having more money in their pocket. There are lots of other determinants of whether people feel that they have a better life or not. So we're not necessarily about maximizing productivity or maximizing economic growth, okay? Not denying that those issues are significant, but pursuit of those goals to the exclusion of others that are consistent with human flourishing may not be productive for human flourishing. So this idea of frame 3 thinking may seem somewhat provisional, and in fact, you'll see that there are some open ends, some need for further development, because frame 3 thinking is relatively new. It's really an attempt to more formalize things that are bubbling up through social movements and social innovation and people that are trying to make a difference in the world with regard to sustainability and other social goals. Okay? It's a way to theorize and think about how those activities are related to traditional thinking about innovation, science, and technology policy. So now let's talk about problems of uncertainty and directionality. Because I'm sure that many of you may have arrived at this point in the talk and had a feeling a little bit like the two guys to the blackboard with some mathematics, and in the middle the caption is, "Then a miracle occurs." Okay? And the caption at the bottom is, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, the one in which the miracle happens." So frame 3 is based upon a theory of social change. Okay? So there are many theories of social change. Frame 3 is based upon an idea called the multi-level perspective, or if you prefer, multi-level perspective. So this perspective views society as having 3 fundamental structures in it. One structure is the landscape. The landscape is the set of rules, norms, social customs, culture, laws that apply to activities within the society. It also encompasses, the landscape also encompasses social opinion. So what is viewed as a normal thing, which we often refer to as social norms. That landscape then typically reinforces the reproduction and continuation of particular ways of doing things. What Nelson and Winter would refer to as organizational routines, and what socio-technical scholars, transition scholars, see as regimes within society. So a regime is an ordering of actors, purposes, and methods that tends to be reproduced over time and reinforced over time into a pattern of incumbency. And the problem here is that incumbent regime is often incompatible with making a deep transition. But at a more basic level, if we think about how fundamental change occurs in society, it's a question of how alternatives percolate from small to large, how they're replicated, spread. Economists would like the word diffused, how they circulate within society. From an initial instance, a localized context, more broadly. Okay. Until the point that they may challenge the existing regime. What we call those bubbles, the percolation bubbles that change the regime, we call those niches. Okay. So it's not obvious or certain that a niche can exist because the incumbent ways of doing things are very powerful. Okay. You want to make a steam-powered automobile? Yeah, well, maybe you can. And maybe you can sell it to 200 or 300 people. Okay. So there's a problem here, okay, that niches have a lot of resistances and barriers to overcome if they are to replace the existing regime. And we'd like to put things in pictures, and this is the picture that we come up with in depicting the process of social change in the multi-level perspective. The MLP, the multi-level perspective, suggests that change occurs when there are pressures on the existing regime from the landscape and when niches are able to become aligned to create a new configuration. What does that mean? Well, in London, I live beside the Thames. And it's fortunate that I live beside the Thames in 2019 and not some earlier century. Because in an earlier century, the Thames was a sewer. Okay? And the place in London where I lived was the Docklands. And in the Docklands, there were piles and piles of manure, with all the things that come with manure. Regimes had to change in order for that place that I live in to be a fair place to live. Okay? Now, I'm not implying that the changes were made in order to accommodate my lifestyle, but fortunately they were made because people resisted the existing regime and because alternatives were available. Okay? Similarly, if I had lived there during the 1960s, it would have been very punishing. Air quality is not really good as it is, better alongside the river, but London air quality in the 50s and the 60s was still very much shaped by coal consumption. Okay? And the famous London fog was largely pollution. Okay? So what happened in those various regimes that I've mentioned, horse-drawn carriage, okay? The idea of public sanitation, okay? So the question of how sanitation is organized, and the question of how energy is generated, were all systems that have changed in the last century. Okay? They've changed through this process of an incumbent regime which was merrily reproducing itself from generation to generation, coming under pressure from the regime, from the landscape, from the people's ideas about how the world should be, and from pressure from below, from alternatives that were offered to the existing regime. The combination of the two is the powerful instrument by which change is occurring. Paloma.
Thank you. Can you tell us what those little arrows represent in the graph?
These arrows here are niches which aren't necessarily going anywhere. Okay? There's a steam automobile at the period in which the regime of the petrol and diesel-fueled automobile taking control of the mobility regime. These arrows, the red ones, are an indication that some of those niches have been selected out as being able to actively contest the existing incumbent regime. And because they're becoming more aligned with it, there's a real possibility that they'll simply be co-opted within it. Okay? There's no necessity that they replace it. Okay? They may be included within it by some adaptation. On the other hand, they may represent a significant enough departure that there is really an alternative regime which is very different than the past. And so as we move from the left to the right, which is a movement in time, we're developing a new configuration, whether it be a configuration that involves the co-optation or the replacement of the prior regime. One more idea about uncertainty and directionality here. This is really the same kind of diagram as I had a moment ago. It's another way to understand regime change, which is more schematic. It separates out two ideas. One is that the routines represent rules or ways of doing things. So if I have a rule such as make things with no attention to recycling. So make things to throw away. Okay? That may change. Okay? People may observe we're using more and more and more and more of our land as landfill. Okay? And that interferes with our food security. Landfill sites leach pollution into the groundwater and so forth and so on. We may come to resist and in fact find society to be too wasteful. And the rule might change to make things be recyclable or reusable. It might become a social norm. You're only willing to buy things that are recyclable or reusable. People are forced to produce things that are recyclable or reusable by law. A variety of possible ways to get there, but those ways amount to external pressure for change, which has the effect of, on the stable, dominant socio-technical regime, of eroding it and making it unstable. So a movement from the upper right-hand corner in which the stability of the rules is high and the percentage of population using the rules is also high, towards a low stability of the rules and a declining number of people that are using those rules. But then it's quite important that there be some alternative, okay? That someone actually be making things that are recyclable or reusable, okay? And that comes out of the niches that we saw in the previous diagram. And those niches evolve to offer an alternative to the regime. And as they evolve, as in the red arrows in the previous diagram, they converge and align in a way that makes them possible substitutes in which we can have a wide breakthrough and the regime grows to be the new regime, the new stable dominant regime. So this is the theory of social change. You see that it emphasizes the significance of niches, of eruptions of novelty and change, their incorporation and embedding through a process of competition aided by external pressures, with the possibility that those niches might be embedded or inside the existing regime merely as reforms. So finally here on the underlying theory, there is the question and the use of the word directionality. This is a favorite word of my colleague Andy Sterling, and I think is a very well-chosen word to speak about the path that technology takes over time, because it not only incorporates the fact that we know from research that much of technical change is incremental, occurs in small steps, and builds upon the immediate past achievements, and therefore has a degree of predictability to it, but also that incremental process describes a trajectory that has a direction. And that direction for most of the history of after the first deep transition was increasing energy intensity. So once upon a time, there was a very modest use of energy on the farm, because energy meant human and animal labor. Then we have mechanization of agriculture. Then we have artificial fertilizers, which are produced through energy-intensive processes. We have further chemical additives, which further use energy in the production of food. And all of this has a benefit, which is more and cheaper food, but it also has a cost in terms of the sustainability of the agricultural system. So if we talk about that process across many socio-technical systems, we can see a series of eruptions which could be thought of as surges in productivity and output. So one of these, for example, is the surge in the use of petroleum rather than coal. And another might be the use of natural gas rather than petroleum. Okay? They're all following along this trajectory that was established in the first deep transition. At the same time, we have a collection of arrows again, okay? These niches that are going in different directions, some of them more aligned with the existing energy-intensive use, some of them less aligned. And if there is to be a second deep transition, those arrows have to accumulate and become more aligned so that they can influence the development of a new trajectory, a new path, a new direction. that's the underlying theory. Now I'm going to turn to the issue of how policy might address the world that we live in using a kind of frame 3 thinking. How do we actually make relevant policy in that world? Okay. Well, if we take on frame 3 thinking, then the foundations of transformative innovation policy must acknowledge the need for inclusivity. Why am I so keen on inclusivity, and why am I so hostile towards technocratic elites? Well, you may have observed around the world or in your own society that all is not well with regard to social cohesion. And it's not merely a matter of income distribution. It's a matter of the degree of understanding and agreement with the agenda for the future, for imaginary for the future. Okay? Is it imaginary for the future in which you have a smaller chance of becoming very wealthy than you do of winning the lottery? Of course, if you're in the right lottery, you might become very wealthy. But this very small chance of social advancement is a problem. And not only, but the feeling that we once did valuable things, things that were valued by society, things that were valued by each other, things that were valued within our communities, we're no longer able to do those things. This is the impact of globalization. Other people are doing those things now. Now some people say, well, okay, so I'm not sure I really wanted to be an automobile factory worker. It was certainly an opportunity available to me as a young person. Okay? I have friends who spent their entire lives as automobile factory workers. Okay? But there are equally many more people from my generation said, I don't think the automobile industry has a great future. I'm going to go and find some other activity, some other pursuit that I can do that has a greater chance of stability and long-term opportunity. And those of us that pursued that path actually found, well, there wasn't just one thing, because the whole world was changing, and you had to do many different things. So it was much more about gathering a portfolio of skills and capabilities than it was pursuing a career. In any case, we were more adaptable and flexible to those changes than those that we left behind. But those who left behind became a problem. Now, here we have also the question of uncertainty. Okay? And with regard to uncertainty, we have uncertainty about how niche development will occur and whether it will be a successful replacement for the incumbent regime. And we have the possibility for transformative change within the existing regime that I mentioned just a moment ago. And finally, we have the resistance of existing regimes to transformation. All of these things are things that we need to acknowledge in thinking about policy. So what these things imply is that we need to work to anticipate or imagine future opportunities and developments. Bipishe.
So you're talking about that, okay, we have a lot of, we have fundamental uncertainties about, about niche developments and scientific advances. So in such circumstances, how do you then anticipate a second deep transition or the kind of technological developments that you're talking about?
It's very difficult to anticipate the second deep transition. Okay? We don't know, just as much as we don't have a blueprint for it, okay? We don't even have a concept sketch for it, okay? All we can say is it will be more sustainable than our current system, okay? So, but we do know that we will have to make changes in existing socio-technical systems. So we can look in those socio-technical systems, look at the trajectory that they're on, and that's what I mean by anticipation, okay? Look at the alternatives, look to see whether they really offer an alternative that is more sustainable. Imagine their future development as a possibility or potential, and weigh existing versus alternative developments in order to come up with a bias or direction in the policies that we establish. So that's what we mean by anticipation, processes of anticipation. And yes, that's a useful place for a technocratic elite to participate, but it's also a useful site, useful activity for ordinary people to participate in, because they experience these developments. They're part of the society in which they're embedded, they're part of. They should be included as well in attempting to anticipate future developments. And finally, a willingness to engage in conflict, a struggle at a political level, because there will be resistances, there will be barriers, there will be blockages to attempts to change. The existing regime reproduces itself, and by virtue of doing that, accumulates substantial power. And by power, I mean coercive force, often backed by the state, which in many societies have a monopoly on the use of lethal force. Don't underestimate the extent to which struggle can become very difficult. So many people that we're attempting to address are either presently or will in the future be involved as policymakers or advisors to policymakers. And so for them, a key question is, at a programmatic or project level, what does transformative innovation policy mean? Well, first, remember, we don't have a blueprint. So what we need is experimentation. We need to try things out to develop these different anticipations of the future, different understandings of possibilities, in order to assess alternatives with a particular attention, and this is what we're taking from frame 2, to the cumulative learning about the domains in which the experiments are lodged. Second, we need new means of evaluation that are not completely captured by the audit culture, the value for money, the return on investment, but that are oriented towards improving the learning from the experiment so that you can do better the next time when you know more. And we need to develop human capabilities to anticipate, experiment, and evaluate. Here it's important to note that you don't have to start with a clean sheet of paper, that projects that are not transformation-led can be stretched to have greater transformative potential. And some particular criteria for selecting sites or project opportunities are included in this next slide. This is a slide developed earlier in our work, and these 6 criteria or categories are provisional in nature. They're subject to revision and development, but these are ideas that we think are relevant for thinking about changing directionality and improving the transformational potential of projects. To think explicitly about directionality, what social goal you're addressing, the system-level impact of the experiment or project or program, the possibilities for learning and reflexivity, the ability to critically reflect upon what you have experienced. The question, are you just going with the flow, or are you actually taking some exception with the way things are, the business as usual, and inclusiveness? Who exactly are you excluding, and who are you including in this process? And if you think about all of those as kinds of weights to look at in selecting a project or program, or indeed in trying to stretch an existing project or program to have more transformative potential, then I would argue that these are a good starting point. But they can be improved, and we intend to. Now, in the final chapter, I'm going to tell you about TIPC. So the title of this talk was A Journey Through Transformative Innovation Policy. And it's been my great pleasure to be involved in a very innovative and ambitious effort to bring transformative innovation policy from our author desks of the researcher into actual practice in the world. Okay? And we've been very fortunate in this regard to find people who are willing to get together to form the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium, or TIPC for short. Okay? TIPC is international, as you can see by the map, and there are 7 members of TIPC, 6 of whom are founding members. Subsequently, Mexico has joined. And we also have 6 associate members. Some, like China, are unable to participate in the administrative structure that we have for TIPC. Others are not in a position to contribute the resources that we require for a full membership, or are at an early stage of their involvement. So all in all, there are 13 different organizations involved in this activity. Chantal.
Thank you, Ed. It's very exciting to see the members and associates so widely distributed around the world, but I noticed from the slides that most of the members and associates are science and funding agencies. Can you explain a little why that's the case?
We usually say, and to be honest with you, it's a little bit objectionable, that this is a coalition of the willing. Okay? These are organizations that had the means to contribute to a common resource pool for running the consortium, for engaging activities, have the ability to put policies into place, and have a need or a demand for engaging with a different way to approach innovation policy, because they take Sustainable Development Goals very seriously, because they think that the existing ways of thinking and managing follow models like fund and forget, which is a kind of frame one thinking, or manage networks in order to improve linkages, but that's not directly addressing the social needs, and it's too complicated to explain to other policymakers. Or some other reason, they think that something new is required. And for them, the appeal of frame three thinking is that we're tackling social needs issues quite directly, rather than expecting it to come indirectly through improved economic growth, productivity, or just a larger stock of knowledge to apply to problems. Okay. We're engaged in after having had a fairly successful initial pilot year, we're now engaged in a 5-year program amongst the consortium members, which involves activities in those domains that I identified earlier of evaluation, policy experimentation, training skills and capabilities. And at the end of the day, we're not doing this as a consultancy activity. We have an interest in research and knowledge co-production. So in other words, we want to participate with the members of the consortium in documenting and producing knowledge about this approach. And where it works, where it doesn't work, where it's useful, where it doesn't have a use, how it encounters barriers and how those barriers are overcome or accommodated to. All of those become grist for the research process. And one can also think about this as being supported by a process of networking to achieve impact, which requires communication and engagement. TIPC is meant to be a coordination of those activities. With this band around here, the country-specific implementation projects being the specific sites of experimentation and learning that we will be engaging with during the 5-year program. What next? We have some videos. This video will be one of them. We can have further readings at the website. We're on Twitter, and I thank you very much.